The producers saw it first. Not on the screen, in the data. Within minutes of her segment airing, internal metrics began doing something that doesn't usually happen during pregame coverage. They didn't climb gradually. They jumped. Viewer retention ticked upward. Engagement rates spiked. Clip shares accelerated faster than the game highlights themselves. Analysts backstage reportedly double-checked dashboards thinking it was a glitch. It wasn't. People weren't just watching. They were staying. And in modern sports media, that's everything. Attention today is ruthless. Viewers scroll instantly. They mute segments. They switch apps during ad breaks. If something doesn't grip them immediately, it's gone. But during her analysis, people didn't scroll. They leaned in. There's a massive difference between someone being popular and someone being magnetic. Popularity can be manufactured with promotion. Magnetism shows up in watch time. And watch time doesn't lie. Her breakdown clips were circulating across platforms before halftime. Not because a network forced them into feeds, but because viewers were voluntarily sharing them. That distinction matters. Because critics often assume media elevation is engineered. That networks push certain faces harder. That algorithms are manipulated. But algorithms respond to behavior. And behavior was loud. This wasn't college nostalgia bleeding into professional coverage. This wasn't a novelty boost. It was the same phenomenon that had followed her for years, now operating in a completely different arena. NBC already had a preview of this power. When one of her record-breaking college games was placed behind a streaming paywall, subscriptions surged. People paid. Not because they were told to. Because they didn't want to miss it. That's not hype. That's conversion. And conversion is the holy grail in media economics. What February proved is that her impact wasn't confined to the court. It translated to commentary, to analysis, to simply being present in a broadcast space. That's rare. Plenty of great players struggle on camera. Some Hall of Famers never find rhythm in studio roles. Being elite at basketball doesn't automatically mean you can explain it in real time with clarity. She could. And viewers responded accordingly. What made executives quietly excited, and others quietly uncomfortable, was this. Her segment wasn't outperforming because it was controversial. It wasn't messy. It wasn't dramatic. There were no viral arguments. It was just compelling. Pure basketball intelligence delivered in a way that felt accessible without being watered down. Casual fans felt smarter listening to her. Hardcore fans felt respected. That combination is dangerous. In a good way. Because when someone can bridge audiences like that, they stop being niche. They become central. If you've been following shifts in sports media over the last few years, you can probably see why this moment hit differently. And if you enjoy breakdowns like this, the behind-the-scenes power shifts that don't show up in box scores, this is exactly what we unpack here. You already know what to do. But here's where things get complicated. While executives were celebrating rising engagement curves, not everyone in the basketball world was applauding. Because numbers don't just measure success. They expose imbalance. And imbalance makes people uncomfortable. Revision ready. Not everyone was smiling that night. While viewers were replaying clips and executives were refreshing analytics dashboards, another reaction was unfolding. Quieter, but just as real. Because what happened in that studio wasn't just a strong media performance. It was symbolic. For years, the WNBA has operated under a very specific philosophy. Growth was supposed to be collective. Marketing focused on the league. The message was consistent. No single player stands above the game. It was a model built on balance. But balance shifts when one name starts pulling disproportionate gravity. And gravity is exactly what Caitlin Clark has. Her rise didn't come with public complaints. She didn't demand special treatment. She didn't criticize coverage. She simply played in a way that made people pay attention, and then continued being herself when the cameras stayed on. That's what makes this tension complicated. Because no one can point to something she did wrong. She didn't disrespect anyone. She didn't overstep. She didn't force headlines. Yet the headlines followed her anyway. Behind the scenes and across social platforms, a familiar question started echoing again. Why her? It's a loaded question. Not because it lacks legitimacy, but because it forces people to confront uncomfortable answers. There are veterans who've been in the league for years. Champions. All-stars. Players who've grinded through seasons when national attention barely flickered. Many of them have extraordinary skill sets and compelling stories. And yet, none of them triggered this kind of surge. That disparity stings. Especially in a league that built its identity around shared elevation rather than singular dominance. But attention doesn't operate on fairness. It operates on instinct. Fans don't consciously calculate who deserves coverage. They react to what captivates them. And something about her game, the range, the confidence, the audacity, creates moments that feel larger than the scoreboard. Those moments spread. And once they spread, perception shifts. The tension isn't necessarily personal. It's structural. If one player can generate more national engagement than an entire collective marketing strategy, then the strategy itself comes into question. That's where discomfort grows. Because institutions prefer predictability. They prefer systems they can manage. They prefer narratives that unfold gradually. But meteoric attention doesn't ask for permission. It accelerates. And acceleration exposes fault lines. On social media, debates intensified. Some framed her coverage as evidence of favoritism. Others pointed to cultural factors. Others insisted it was purely performance-driven. The truth. It's rarely one thing. But what can't be denied is this. Viewers chose her. Not because they were told to. Not because they were pressured to. Because they wanted to. That distinction is critical. It reframes the entire conversation from media manipulation to market response. And markets don't negotiate emotions. They reflect them. Which brings us to something even more uncomfortable. Not all excellence translates the same way. Some players are elite. Others are electric. And electricity changes everything. Revision ready. There's a difference people don't like to talk about. You can be great. Or you can be magnetic. Both require skill. Both require work. But only one makes casual fans stop mid-scroll. Caitlin Clark doesn't just execute plays. She creates moments. That logo 3 that feels slightly unreasonable. The no-look pass that bends a defense before anyone realizes it's broken. The confidence to pull up from a distance most players wouldn't even consider. Those aren't just statistics. They're shareable. And that's where the conversation changes. Because in today's sports world, virality matters almost as much as efficiency. A technically flawless 18-point performance might win a game, but a 32-foot pull-up with swagger wins the internet. And the internet drives the narrative. That's the piece critics struggle with. It's easier to measure points per game than presence. Easier to compare stat sheets than emotional impact. But fans don't fall in love with spreadsheets. They fall in love with feeling something. And when she plays, or speaks, people feel something. Excitement. Anticipation. Even irritation sometimes. But emotion is engagement. Indifference is the real danger. She never inspires indifference. That's why her moments circulate faster than most. When she launched those deep shots in college, they weren't just buckets. They were statements. When she dissected defensive rotations on live TV, it wasn't just analysis. It was proof. Proof that she sees the game differently. And when someone consistently makes viewers feel like they're watching something slightly unpredictable, slightly audacious, they become appointment viewing. It's not about being the most decorated. It's about being the most watchable. That distinction shifts power. Because once audiences decide someone is must-watch, institutions have to respond. Networks adjust programming. Sponsors reposition campaigns. Commentators adapt their coverage. The ecosystem bends toward attention. And that bending doesn't feel fair to everyone inside it. Which is understandable. There are players who've built incredible careers without the viral spotlight. Players whose games are surgical, precise, disciplined. but they don't generate the same adrenaline. Electricity is rare. It can't be coached into existence. And once it's recognized, it multiplies. That's what February revealed. Her appeal wasn't confined to game night heroics. It extended into conversation, into authority, into analysis. She wasn't just electric with a ball in her hands. She was compelling with a microphone. That combination, that's disruptive. Because it means the influence doesn't turn off in the off-season. And when influence becomes year-round, the power dynamic changes again. We're only 4 sections in, and the implications are already widening. Revision ready. There's an invisible line in professional basketball. Most fans don't consciously see it, but it's there. It separates leagues. It separates generations. And most of all, it separates who gets to speak as an authority, and who gets invited as a feature. That night, that line blurred. Caitlin Clark wasn't treated like a novelty crossover story. She wasn't framed as the face of women's basketball, making a symbolic appearance. The conversation didn't orbit around her gender or her league. It revolved around basketball. That distinction might sound small. It isn't. When former NBA legends engage with someone on equal footing, building on her observations, adjusting to her reads, even nodding in agreement when she breaks something down, that's not courtesy. That's respect. And respect in basketball media isn't handed out easily. It's earned in real time. There was no condescension. No soft questions designed to make her comfortable. No protective framing. They talked scheme. They talked matchups. They talked adjustments like she'd been on that panel for years. And viewers noticed something subtle. No one seemed surprised by her insight after the first few exchanges. It quickly became normal. That normalization is what makes this moment historic. Because for decades, conversations about women in sports media have often centered around representation, visibility, inclusion. This wasn't about inclusion. This was about competence. And when competence becomes undeniable, the framing shifts. She wasn't there because it was progressive. She was there because she added value. That changes the conversation. It forces the industry to reconsider assumptions about who belongs in which spaces. It challenges the idea that expertise must stay confined within league boundaries. Once a WNBA star can seamlessly analyze NBA action in prime time, the separation begins to feel artificial. And artificial boundaries eventually collapse. Now imagine you're someone who built a career inside those boundaries. Someone who benefited from clearly defined lanes. From structured hierarchies. Suddenly, the lanes look negotiable. That's destabilizing. Because authority isn't just about knowledge. It's about positioning. And positioning determines opportunity. If the walls between leagues start thinning, new pathways open. More crossovers. More shared platforms. More voices. For some, that's progress. For others, that's uncertainty. But what made this particular moment powerful wasn't confrontation. It was calm confidence. She didn't push her way in. She simply performed at a level that made exclusion look irrational. That's a different kind of disruption. It doesn't explode systems. It exposes them. And exposure forces decisions. Because once viewers accept someone as a legitimate voice, pulling that voice back becomes risky. It starts to look intentional. And in the age of transparency, intentional gatekeeping doesn't age well. What happened that night wasn't loud. But it was irreversible. And when something becomes irreversible, the real adjustments happen behind closed doors. That's where the leverage conversation begins. Revision ready. There's a moment in every breakout story where attention turns into power. February wasn't just about strong ratings or viral clips. It was about leverage. Because once you prove you can move numbers in multiple environments, your value multiplies. On the court, she drives ticket sales. On television, she boosts retention. On social platforms, she accelerates engagement. That's not just popularity. That's cross-platform influence. And cross-platform influence is currency. Behind the scenes, Conversations shift quickly when that kind of currency shows up. Executives don't just celebrate, they strategize. How often should she appear? How do we feature her without letting the entire broadcast orbit around her? How do we maximize this without creating backlash? Those aren't emotional questions. They're business questions. Because influence disrupts balance sheets just as much as it disrupts narratives. For years, networks treated leagues as the anchor and players as components. But when a single personality begins drawing independent gravity, the hierarchy flips. Now the player becomes the anchor. And that changes negotiation dynamics. Sponsorship conversations become different. Media scheduling becomes different. Even off-season relevance becomes different. Most athletes fade slightly once their season ends. Her presence doesn't. If anything, it expands. That's rare air. There are only a handful of basketball figures who've managed to transcend active competition and remain central in conversation year-round. And most of them built that presence over decades. She's doing it at the beginning. That acceleration is what makes institutions uneasy. Because once someone proves they don't need a single lane to stay relevant, containment becomes impossible. And make no mistake, every major league prefers some level of containment. Structure creates stability. Predictability protects partnerships. But organic demand doesn't operate on structure. It spreads where it wants. The question behind closed doors isn't whether she's valuable. That's obvious. The question is how much control remains. Because when audiences start following a personality more than a platform, power shifts subtly but permanently. Viewers don't tune in just for the league. They tune in for her perspective. That's leverage. And leverage compounds. If she continues appearing in NBA spaces, continues demonstrating authority, continues moving metrics, the negotiation table looks very different in 5 years. Not just for her. For everyone. The ecosystem adjusts around gravitational forces. And right now, she's generating one. What makes this even more complicated is that she hasn't demanded anything publicly. No ultimatums. No dramatic statements. No, look at me, declarations. She's simply performing. And performance is hard to argue against. But once performance translates into influence, and influence into leverage, the real tension begins. Because power rarely changes hands quietly. It resists. And that resistance is already forming. Revision ready. Let's fast forward. Not in fantasy. Not in hype. Just in trajectory. Imagine this momentum doesn't slow down. She continues dominating headlines during the WNBA season. Arenas sell out when she visits. Road crowds feel like playoff atmospheres. Ratings climb not just for her team, but for matchups connected to her. That alone would be historic. But now layer this in. Every off-season, she appears regularly on major NBA broadcasts. Not as a one-time guest. Not as a novelty. As a recurring analyst. A recognized voice. Audiences grow accustomed to her presence. It becomes normal. That normalization is powerful. Because once something feels normal, it stops being debated. And that's where the old structure starts to tremble. Now factor in endorsements. Her signature Nike line expands across demographics. Young boys are wearing her sneakers. Casual fans who've never attended a WNBA game recognize her instantly. Social media following climbs into territory typically reserved for global superstars. At that point, she's not just an athlete. She's a brand. And brands don't wait for institutional approval to expand. They grow where demand exists. This is the scenario that keeps traditionalists slightly uneasy. Not because it's bad for the sport, but because it shifts the center of gravity. If one active player becomes bigger than the league's collective marketing framework, the framework must adapt, or risk irrelevance. And adaptation isn't always comfortable. The original philosophy emphasized equality of spotlight, shared growth, balanced attention. But markets don't distribute attention evenly. They amplify what captivates. If her trajectory continues, it forces a question the establishment has quietly avoided. Was the collective first model about unity, or about control? That's not an accusation. It's a strategic dilemma. Because star-driven ecosystems operate differently. They're faster, more volatile, more dependent on personality. But they're also more explosive in scale. Think about the ripple effect. Young players entering the league now aren't just thinking about contracts. They're thinking about platform, visibility, crossover potential. Once a blueprint exists, others follow it. And that's when a moment becomes a movement. The February broadcast wasn't just a good segment. It was proof of concept. Proof that crossover authority works. Proof that audiences will accept, and even prefer, integration over separation. Proof that basketball at its core is about skill and insight, not league labels. And if that proof keeps stacking, the 5-year outlook stops looking hypothetical. It starts looking inevitable. Which leads to the real question. If this rise continues uninterrupted, who benefits the most? And who feels left behind? Because every power shift creates both. Revision ready. At first, the pushback was quiet. A few raised eyebrows. A few side comments. A few carefully worded podcast takes that sounded supportive on the surface but carried a certain edge underneath. Then it got louder. Not explosive. Not chaotic. Just sharper. Because when one figure absorbs a disproportionate amount of attention, conversations inevitably turn toward fairness. Why is she everywhere? Why does every broadcast circle back to her? Why does every ratings conversation include her name? These aren't irrational questions. They're human ones. There are veterans who've poured years into building this league. Players who endured seasons without national coverage. Players who helped lay the foundation long before casual fans started paying attention. And now, suddenly, one name dominates headlines. That shift feels abrupt, especially from the inside. But here's what complicates the resistance. Nothing about her rise has required diminishing anyone else. She hasn't publicly positioned herself above peers. She hasn't fueled comparisons. She hasn't leaned into controversy. The comparisons happen anyway. Because attention forces comparison. And attention is finite. When media space expands for one player, it can feel like it shrinks for others, even if total coverage is increasing overall. That perception matters. It fuels tension. Online debates intensified. Some framed the coverage as favoritism. Others argued it was purely performance-based. Cultural factors were pulled into the conversation. Old grievances resurfaced. The discourse grew layered. But beneath all the noise, the numbers stayed consistent. Viewers kept clicking, kept watching, kept sharing. That's the part resistance can't override. You can criticize narrative framing. You can question media strategy. You can challenge representation dynamics. But you can't fake watch time. And watch time kept validating her presence. That creates a strange paradox. The more pushback emerges, the more curiosity grows. The more curiosity grows, the more visibility increases. Resistance, unintentionally, becomes fuel. And that's when tension evolves from debate into inevitability. Because once a player becomes central to both praise and criticism, they've crossed into something bigger than hype. They've entered cultural relevance. Cultural relevance doesn't ask for consensus. It thrives on friction. That's where we are now. The pushback isn't stopping momentum. It's highlighting it. And here's the deeper layer most people haven't fully processed yet. If resistance continues while the audience continues choosing her, institutions eventually face a decision. Align with demand, or attempt to contain it. History shows which strategy survives longer. Revision ready. Every league eventually faces a defining choice. Not about rules. Not about scheduling. About identity. February didn't just elevate a player, it forced a philosophical question into the open. What drives growth? Is it balanced exposure across a collective? Or is it embracing star power when it naturally emerges? For years, the messaging leaned toward collective elevation. Promote the league. Promote the teams. promote parity. It was stable, measured, controlled. But now there's proof, visible, measurable proof, that one personality can accelerate attention faster than any long-term campaign. That's not theory. That's data. And data forces decisions. Because once executives see that a single segment featuring her outperforms surrounding content, once sponsors notice the spike in engagement, once broadcasters recognize that her analysis keeps viewers from switching channels, the old cautious model becomes harder to defend. Stability feels safe. Acceleration feels risky. But acceleration builds empires. If the league leans fully into her star power, it signals a new era, one that prioritizes magnetism and crossover appeal. It could unlock sponsorship tiers that were previously unreachable. It could attract new demographics permanently. But leaning in also means relinquishing some control. Star-driven ecosystems revolve around individuals. And individuals are unpredictable. Their schedules matter. Their brand matters. Their voice matters. That shifts leverage. If the league resists leaning in, if it downplays the gravitational pull, it risks disconnecting from what fans are clearly signaling. And fans don't wait forever. They follow what excites them. This is the crossroads. Not dramatic on the surface. No press conferences announcing a change in philosophy. No official declarations. But internally, strategy rooms are weighing it carefully. Do you amplify the phenomenon? Or do you attempt to distribute the spotlight evenly? Both paths carry consequences. One prioritizes momentum. The other prioritizes structure. What makes this moment different is that it wasn't forced. No scandal triggered it. No controversy manufactured it. No media stunt created it. It happened organically. And organic movements are the hardest to contain. The February broadcast was a glimpse. Now the long-term direction depends on what institutions choose to do next. Because once fans experience something electric, going back to ordinary feels difficult. Revision ready. You can always tell when something shifts in sports culture. It's not announced. It shows up in repetition. After that broadcast, her name didn't fade from the cycle. It multiplied. Morning shows referenced her analysis. Debate segments pulled clips. Podcasts dissected her takes. Even analysts who hadn't previously engaged deeply with the WNBA suddenly had opinions. That's when you know it's bigger than a moment. The media ecosystem began doing what it always does when it senses durable interest. It leaned in. Not aggressively. Not dramatically. Just incrementally. More mentions. More cross-references. More framing her as part of the broader basketball conversation rather than a separate category. And framing changes perception. When someone's commentary sits naturally beside NBA discussions instead of being introduced as a crossover novelty, it rewires audience expectations. She stops being from another league. She becomes one of the voices. That evolution is subtle, but powerful. Because once viewers internalize someone as a regular presence, removing them feels noticeable. That's the stage where influence becomes embedded. It's not about viral spikes anymore. It's about consistency. The biggest stars in sports media didn't become dominant because of one explosive appearance. They became dominant because they kept showing up, and audiences kept choosing them. The early signs suggest that pattern may be forming here. Her name generates clicks. Her clips generate discussion. Her perspective generates engagement. In a content economy driven by algorithms and retention curves, those are golden signals. Networks notice golden signals. And when networks notice, programming evolves. You start seeing more integration, more strategic appearances, more positioning that keeps her within mainstream basketball dialogue year-round. That's how orbit begins. Not because a league declares it, but because the audience pulls it into motion. The interesting part? This isn't replacing traditional NBA coverage. It's expanding it. That's the nuance critics sometimes miss. Her presence doesn't shrink men's basketball conversations. It broadens the lens of who gets to participate in them. And that broader lens attracts new viewers. New viewers change demographics. Demographics change sponsorship value. Sponsorship value changes priorities. That's how cultural shifts unfold, quietly at first. The February segment wasn't just a breakout. It was a signal to the media industry that integration works. And once something works in media, it rarely retreats. It scales. Revision ready. Here's something wild. Most athletes don't enter legacy conversations until they're near the end. Championship count. Career totals. Hall of Fame debates. That's when those discussions usually start. But with her, legacy whispers started almost immediately. Not because she's finished anything. Because she disrupted something. There's a difference between building a resume and shifting a landscape. She's still early in her professional career. Still adding chapters. Still adapting to the pace and physicality of the league. And yet, she's already altered how media, fans, and executives talk about women's basketball. That's rare. You can win titles without changing structure. You can dominate statistically without altering perception. But forcing an entire ecosystem to reconsider its model? That's different. That's legacy-level impact, even before rings enter the conversation. Think about it. Before her rise, crossover conversations between WNBA players and mainstream NBA broadcast spaces were limited. Occasional appearances, sure. But not central positioning. Now it feels plausible. Before her, rating spikes were celebrated as isolated moments. Now they're being analyzed as sustainable trends tied to individual magnetism. Before her, debates around marketing philosophy stayed internal. Now they're public. That's what landscape shifts look like. They create new baselines. And new baselines change what future players expect. A young guard entering the league today isn't just dreaming about all-star selections. She's thinking about brand expansion, media presence, signature deals, cross-league relevance. That wasn't the blueprint before. Now it is. And when a blueprint changes, history notes it. What makes this even more fascinating is that she didn't campaign for any of this. She didn't frame herself as revolutionary. She didn't declare she was changing the game off the court. She just kept showing up prepared. Sometimes that's how disruption works. It doesn't shout. It performs. But legacy conversations also invite pressure. Because once expectations elevate, scrutiny follows. Every performance becomes a referendum. Every broadcast appearance becomes a test. Every quote becomes dissected. That's the cost of influence. And the next chapter will determine whether this momentum compounds or plateaus. Because sustaining attention is harder than capturing it. And the spotlight, once fixed, rarely softens. Revision ready. Attention feels exciting at first. But attention has weight. The more visible you become, the smaller your margin for error gets. Every missed shot becomes a headline. Every tough game becomes a narrative shift. Every comment gets dissected frame by frame. That's where things get real. Because breaking through is one challenge. Staying there is another. Now every broadcast appearance carries expectation. Not curiosity, expectation. Viewers don't tune in wondering if she belongs anymore. They tune in assuming she'll deliver. And assumptions are heavier than doubts. On the court, defenses adjust. Opponents circle matchups on the calendar. Road arenas treat her arrival like an event. That kind of atmosphere drains energy over time. Off the court, media cycles compress. One quiet week becomes momentum cooling. One strong week becomes proving them wrong. The pendulum swings faster when you're central to the conversation. This is where many stars stumble. Not because they lack talent. Because the noise gets loud. But here's what makes this situation different. She's been living inside national scrutiny since college. Record chases. Tournament runs. Social media storms. Debate shows dissecting her every move. Pressure isn't new. Scale is. The platform is larger now. The implications wider. The stakes higher. And here's the hidden layer most people overlook. The establishment isn't just watching her games. They're watching her response. How does she handle criticism? How does she respond to pushback? Does she lean into controversy or stay focused? Because sustained influence requires composure. If she maintains clarity under scrutiny, the narrative strengthens. If she falters publicly, critics gain leverage. That's the delicate balance. And the scrutiny isn't always loud. Sometimes it's subtle. A shift in tone. A change in panel energy. A segment that frames things slightly differently. Small signals. But in high-level media ecosystems, small signals matter. This phase determines longevity. Capturing attention proves potential. Handling scrutiny proves durability. And durability is what transforms moments into eras. Right now, she's still in the proving stage of this new chapter. But if she navigates this period the way she's navigated everything else so far, the conversation shifts again. From breakout story to fixture. And once someone becomes a fixture, removing them isn't a discussion anymore. It's impossible. Revision ready. There's a point when an athlete stops being just an athlete. It doesn't happen overnight. It's not declared in a press release. It reveals itself when conversations about that player start appearing in places that have nothing to do with box scores. We're approaching that territory. Her influence isn't confined to arenas or studio desks anymore. It's showing up in marketing campaigns, youth participation conversations, sneaker culture, social debates, even broader discussions about visibility in sports. That's when you know the ripple effect is widening. Young players aren't just mimicking her shooting range. They're mimicking her confidence. That matters more than people realize. Confidence scales. When young athletes see someone operate comfortably in spaces that previously felt restricted, it rewires what they believe is possible. And possibility changes behavior. Basketball camps report increased interest. Merchandise trends shift. Casual fans who never followed the WNBA suddenly know team rosters. That kind of crossover awareness is rare. Because most sports ecosystems remain segmented. NBA fans stay NBA fans. WNBA fans stay WNBA fans. But once a personality becomes a bridge, the segmentation weakens. And bridges create traffic. What makes this especially significant is timing. Sports culture right now thrives on personality. Storytelling drives engagement as much as performance. Audiences connect with narratives, not just stats. She delivers both. A deep shooting range that feels almost cinematic. A steady composure under debate. A presence that doesn't feel forced. That combination travels well. Brands understand that. Media understands that. And eventually, broader culture absorbs it. This is where influence becomes layered. Layer 1. Performance. Layer 2. Media authority. Layer 3. Cultural relevance. She's stepping into Layer 3. And Layer 3 lasts longer than shooting streaks. Because cultural relevance isn't dependent on a single season. It's dependent on resonance. The more she resonates beyond basketball purists, the harder it becomes to frame her as just a league-specific star. She becomes a basketball figure. Period. That distinction is powerful. Because when labels fall away, ceilings rise. And rising ceilings create new standards. The interesting question now isn't whether she can maintain visibility. It's how far that visibility expands. Because once impact leaves the court, it doesn't easily return. Revision ready. There's always a moment in every power shift where the tension stops being theoretical. It becomes visible. We're getting close to that moment. Because right now, two forces are moving at the same time. On one side, audience demand. Growing. Consistent. Data-backed. On the other, institutional structure. Careful. Strategic. Protective. As long as those forces move in harmony, growth feels smooth. But if they ever start pulling in different directions, that's when the tipping point arrives. Imagine this scenario. Another major broadcast. Another strong performance. Another measurable spike in engagement. And instead of treating it as an isolated success, networks begin scheduling around it. More appearances. more central placement, more integration into flagship coverage. At that stage, it's no longer experimental. It's foundational. And once something becomes foundational, resisting it looks irrational. That's the moment traditional balance gives way to new gravity. Because the ecosystem will naturally orbit the strongest pull. The tipping point isn't about ego. It's about inevitability. If ratings consistently rise when she's featured, if advertisers align campaigns around her visibility, if cross-league conversations continue normalizing her presence, the market makes the decision. And markets move faster than committees. What makes this delicate is that institutions don't like appearing reactive. They prefer to guide change, not chase it. But when organic demand builds momentum, guiding it often means embracing it fully. Half measures rarely hold. And once a player becomes central to both growth strategy and cultural conversation, the hierarchy subtly rearranges. Not publicly, but practically. More leverage in negotiations. More influence in scheduling. More say in platform expansion. That's what tipping points create. They don't explode. They tilt. And once tilted, returning to the previous angle requires force. The question now isn't whether she can handle the spotlight. It's whether the structure around her is ready for what sustained spotlight creates. Because if this trajectory continues, the balance of power in women's professional basketball won't just shift slightly. It will reset. Here's the truth most people won't say out loud. What happened that night wasn't a highlight. It was a signal. A signal that the game, not the rules on the floor, but the rules around attention, has changed. For decades, women's professional basketball fought for visibility, fought for respect, fought for consistent coverage. The strategy was patience, collective growth, measured expansion. And then one player stepped into a primetime NBA studio and casually demonstrated that she didn't need to be framed as women's basketball. She was just basketball. That's the difference. And once audiences internalize that difference, you can't reverse it. You can't tell fans to see her in a smaller box once they've seen her operate in a larger one. You can't convince viewers to downgrade their expectations once they've watched her command a room full of legends. You can't ask the market to ignore what it clearly prefers. This is the point of no return. Not because she demanded it, but because the audience decided it. From here forward, every broadcast will be measured against that standard. Every ratings report will be compared. Every media strategy will account for the gravitational pull she now carries. And here's the part that makes this moment historic. It's not about replacing anyone. It's about expanding what's possible. The walls between leagues feel thinner now. The pathways between platforms feel more open. The ceiling above women's professional basketball feels higher. But higher ceilings require courage. Institutions must decide whether to lean into acceleration or retreat into structure. Veterans must decide whether to resist the spotlight shift or ride the wave it creates. Networks must decide whether to build around organic demand or attempt to distribute it evenly. Those decisions will define the next decade. Because once excellence crosses into authority, and authority crosses into influence, the ecosystem reorganizes itself. Caitlin Clark didn't just enter the conversation. She changed its dimensions. And the most fascinating part? We're still early. If this trajectory continues, 5 years from now we may look back at that February broadcast not as a breakout appearance, but as the night the balance quietly tilted. The night basketball stopped separating itself by labels. The night attention chose its center. Now I want to hear from you. Do you think this momentum reshapes the league long-term? Or does the structure push back harder than ever? Drop your take in the comments. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the power dynamics behind the game, not just the highlights, but the shifts happening underneath, make sure you like the video so more people see it. And if you want more breakdowns like this, where we unpack what's really changing in sports culture before everyone else catches up, hit subscribe and stay with us. Because this story, it's far from over.